right. Well, welcome to my first live YouTube interview. Today I have my friend, David Deppeler. David's a physical therapist in Portland, Oregon, and he just knows some really cool stuff about the breath, about movement. I actually met him. He was doing a Qigong teacher training, and I just thought it was fascinating to get the perspective of someone trained in Western style physiotherapy, and now he's into this sort of more energy based Qigong stuff. So without further ado, I give you David Deppeler. David Deppeler.
Hello,
how are you doing? Good to have you back. We just did this a week ago and we screwed up the recording, so here we are again.
We'll see if we can put the same enthusiasm into this.
Yeah. All right. So first off, so you're a physical therapist, so you kind of have like a lot of training in a movement system and self-healing system. So I guess something that people might be curious about is what got you into Qigong as a physical therapist?
Yeah, I think you're right in categorizing it that it might be a little bit on the fringe, but certainly does fit nicely. What I appreciate about Qigong is the attention to movement, the mindfulness-based aspect of it, and even more so the fact that a lot of it is coordinated with breathing. Over the years, I've come to really appreciate that although you may be able to find certain strategies of when you should breathe in, when you should breathe out, probably the most important thing is just that people are being mindful of their breath during movement and not holding their breath. And Qigong does a fantastic job of guiding people with that aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. And so someone who kind of went through school in science and biology and things like that, so this concept of Qi, you know, this invisible energy that nobody can really seem to prove exists empirically. When you do Qigong, are you thinking about the Qi, or when you're prescribing exercises to people, are you thinking about the Qi, or are you just like, oh, this is a healthy movement, you're getting some good breathing in, getting some good stretching, but not necessarily worrying about the Qi necessarily, or are you a big believer in the Qi?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can tell you that nowhere in my PT training was there a section on Qi.
Yeah.
But I would say I certainly am not at the other end of the extreme where I'm saying, oh, all I really appreciate is the healthy movement and breathing. I can rest my hat on that easily. But no, I have a felt sense, an intuitive sense that there is something more than that. Certainly we know that science doesn't now answer all the questions, and good scientists absolutely believe that. And I can say I have a felt sense with the practice to validate my appreciation of that. So I do think, and there is actually science supporting that we can change blood flow to organs. We can change things by giving them attention. And so it seems to fit real nicely with the idea of Qi follows our intentions, where we put our energy and concentration.
Yeah.
So I have a little personal doubt, yes, that there is something there to that.
Yeah. That was good to keep a little skepticism. Yeah, that reminds me, one thing I heard was the more you relax, the more relaxed state you're in, it actually improves your blood circulation. So as we're relaxing in Qigong, we often feel like the hands get this kind of pressure, and we call it energy, but it might just be blood circulation bringing more heat into the hands. But that might be a lot of it is just you're getting more relaxed, your hands have more blood and heat going to them.
Yeah, that could be it. And there are also a lot of movements in Qigong that are the same hand position, same movements that we use to do what's called neural mobilization, or where we take a nerve, treat it like a piece of dental floss, and slide it through the tissue. So the positions, and so no doubt if you're actually putting a little bit of tension on nervous tissue, you're going to get some tingling, you're going to get some buzzing from that. But who's to say that's not, Qi? I mean, we can take that and look at the action potential down a nerve and say, yeah, it's been this chemical exchange between the nerve membrane. But as you and others have so gracefully put it, there still could be some energy force that's actually leading that's just out in front of it a bit. And we're actually seeing what we can measure and see is kind of the tail end of what that movement of energy has done.
Yeah. It's kind of the conundrum of the eye that can't see itself, right? You can't see. Consciousness can't observe itself, and awareness can't be aware of itself. And sometimes I think about Qi like it's sort of this bridge between the consciousness and the body and the material world, and maybe that's why it's so hard to measure. Maybe it's some like component of consciousness that makes it kind of hard for consciousness itself to be aware of. But anyways, outside of the theoretical stuff, what I really want to talk to you about was the breath. So you do some really interesting work. Actually, a lot you're telling me with yoga practitioners as well as Qigong practitioners. So what you're telling me is we have this idea that in yoga and Qigong, one of the things we teach people to do a lot is to take big breaths. We're using full abdomen, full rib cage movement, and just taking in lots of air. And we have this kind of what you say is a myth that the more air you take in, the more oxygenated your blood's going to become, and therefore the more oxygen you're going to be supplying to all your cells. And you're saying that there's actually some myth behind that. It's a little counterintuitive. Could you walk people through a little bit of why that might not always be a great idea?
Yeah, and you're exactly right. I mean, that behavior around breathing, of taking a bigger breath in as a way to get more oxygen into the cells, doesn't actually work. And it's fascinating when you look at the science behind it. Now, no doubt, it's a noble pursuit, and that is the goal, is to get more oxygen into the body and get it delivered to the tissue that needs it. But under normal heart and lung function, which most of us entering into a yoga class or a Qigong class or going to a gym for exercise, it isn't actually a problem of not expanding the chest enough. It has to do with a couple other key things, not the least of which one of them can be the amount of nitric oxide that's in the system that comes from nasal breathing. It comes from other things as well, but by nasal breathing, nitric oxide is one of the compounds that helps hemoglobin bind oxygen. So here you've got one example of a behavior that, regardless of the volume or the rate that you're breathing in, it has more to do with the quality of the breath, will determine if hemoglobin binds oxygen or not. Now, there's something that's even more exciting than that, and that's what happens to our carbon dioxide level as we breathe. And the short of that story is, breathing is a way to help regulate CO2. The more we breathe relative to a demand, in other words, if we're overbreathing, if we're breathing more than what the physical demand actually requires, let's say taking big deep breaths, especially doing 10 of them, we actually will drop our CO2 level. When we drop our CO2 level, it changes the pH of our blood in a way that now hemoglobin binds oxygen even tighter. And so there'll be plenty of oxygen in the system. We can put a pulse oximeter on someone's finger and see that they're at 98% oxygenation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the tissue is getting the oxygen. So if CO2 is low because of a breathing behavior that is over-breathing relative to the demand, hemoglobin will bind oxygen and the tissue will actually be starved of oxygen. In other words, when your brain tissue asks for oxygen to think more, or when your heart muscle or your smooth muscle in your intestinal system or your musculoskeletal system wants that oxygen, it's going to have to work harder to kind of get it from hemoglobin. Whereas if your CO2 is in this beautiful range, then any tissue that asks for it gets the oxygen.
See, I always thought, I think a lot of people think this, that carbon dioxide is toxic, right?
Right.
It's kind of an idea that goes around, but you actually need some of it in your blood all the time because it's what keeps the blood from getting too alkaline.
Right. Yeah. So the Henderson-Hasselbalch,
it's really only toxic in large amounts.
Correct.
If you have too much, it becomes toxic.
Yes, and no doubt we can say that the average person walking around, again, with relatively normal heart and lung function, the primary breathing dysfunction that we see is that people are over-breathing. They're actually hyperventilating. They're stuck in a chronic state of hyperventilation. So their CO2 levels are actually too low for hemoglobin to let go of oxygen comfortably. And what it means is they just have to work a little bit harder at baseline. All right. So generally, this isn't killing anybody, but it does mean that just sitting comfortably in a chair reading, you may be working harder than what you need to. And that actually robs your ability to rise to the occasion of a demand. Let's say it's a physical workout that you want to do, or it's running down the street, or even just concentrating well. If just at baseline you're working harder than what you should be, those other things will be that much harder. And so it's interesting when you look at practices like yoga and Qigong, which do give a lot of attention to the breath. Now, I think both of them, you actually end up with a net gain because you are being mindful of the breath. And that by itself has really nice attributes, even if what you're doing with your breath isn't helpful. Chemically, just the fact of being mindful is actually a very positive thing. But the story is always playing in my head. What if you could actually take the wisdom that we know from watching CO2 in breathing behavior and incorporate that into yoga and or Qigong? Would we get an even bigger positive effect out of it? And of course, I think the answer is yes.
To have people, little devices on their fingers so you can read your CO2 while you're practicing?
Yeah, right now, the easiest way to read CO2 is with a cannula in your nose, just hooked up to a little box on a computer.
Okay.
But so what goes on your finger is that pulse oximeter.
Yeah.
And you can actually see that change with movement. It's not as sensitive as what watching CO2 is. Now, in the clinic, we don't have people running around with hooked up to the capnography all the time. We'll use the capnography, let's say once a week or once every 2 weeks, where just they get a little bit of time where they're learning what breathing strategies actually move their chemistry in the right direction. And then they're taking that information out in the world and playing with it. And then we come back, we check it again, and then bump them to the next level if they're ready for it. It's nice to have the technology. It's not completely needed. If you understand the concept behind it, and as weird as this sounds, but really to minimize your breathing, to take a little bit of time, whether it's in a restorative practice, a meditation practice, or even doing light movement, if you actually adopt a strategy to say, what if I took a little recreation in breathing as little as I need to, and just watch the way you feel from that?
Yeah, one thing I've noticed doing certain types of meditation, well, some types of meditation, you're sort of controlling your breath a little bit. You're asking it to do something. And other types, the idea is to just watch the breath and let go of it as much as possible, where you're just sort of watching what it does naturally if you intervene as little as possible. And what I often found doing that type of meditation is that that actually naturally happens as the breath becomes smaller and finer and smaller and finer, until I've actually had experiences where it just goes like several minutes where it seems as though I haven't breathed at all. And the mind seems to kind of mimic that. It's like the smaller and finer the breath becomes, the more still consciousness becomes.
Yeah.
Really cool experience. But it's kind of freaky. Like, am I supposed to not be breathing right now? So.
Yeah. Yeah. In some of those restorative positions, your oxygen demands are really low. And so there shouldn't be much air that you're moving.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Well, so you often go into like yoga studios and things like that, and you coach some of the yogis in this. Is there a lot? Does this seem counterintuitive to a lot of people? Because in this sort of yoga world, we do a lot of like the big sort of breathing.
Yeah, it's a fascinating population to work with, because you're exactly right. There is a lot of using the breath, manipulating the breath in that world. And so it's always fun to tell them that breathing less is really better, because they look at you, you know, like, and there's a gasp across the room like it's complete blasphemy. But it doesn't take long before there's a big lean in, and they're wildly excited about it. Because when you hook someone up to the technology and you actually see what makes the CO2 better, they can feel that it also feels good. And what we know from the community is people who breathe well have actually got a big margin of error. So you can take yourself through some pranayama techniques that really do push you into some hyperventilation. And for a lot of people, they'll actually get a really nice reset afterwards. So although during the activity, they'll be very low CO2 or in a hyperventilated state or a hypocapnic state, when they actually stop doing that activity, they come back to their baseline, and their baseline now is improved from what it was before. In other words, just their baseline CO2 is sitting in an even better window. Now, the concerning part is people who go into it struggling with their breathing, which, quite frankly, are a lot of people who seek yoga out, or any type of movement-based practice like this. Those that go into it with breathing dysfunction, when they do things that push them into more hyperventilation, they actually get stuck in it. And eventually their body will equilibrate and they'll come back to whatever the baseline is. But I've seen that take 2 hours. I've seen it take a couple days for people to come back. And it's kind of fun to tell that story to a group of yogis or people sitting in getting ready for a yoga class, because inevitably there'll be 4 or 5 people out of about 20 that will say, I totally know that feeling. Like, I do the pranayama techniques because I'm supposed to, but I don't feel good afterwards, and that feeling hangs on with me.
Yeah. So there's a percentage of people that are particularly prone to becoming hyperoxygenated or carbon dioxide deficient.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Those are the ones that to do a lot of the breathing techniques, the pranayama techniques that involve really big breathing, and those same things that we see in Qigong. For those people, it actually can send them the wrong direction for a while. Mm. You know, I think the first person who in all knowing and in all wisdom said, take a deep breath, didn't say it in English. You know, deep breath is the English translation of whatever that person said. And that deep might not have necessarily meant big. You know, it may have carried a different meaning for that person who said, it's just that in the English language, deep is easily translated to big. But it really could be something more like, you know, take that breath deep in your soul, or take that breath that you actually need, which might be super small. Right? But it is kind of deep and resonates in your body.
Now, is there a difference between the type of breathing that's big, where you're taking in a higher volume, and deep breathing in the sense that you're getting the movement of the breath actually deeper into the body, even if you're not necessarily taking in more volume, like the abdominal breathing that we do a lot in Qigong, or the kidney breathing, where you're getting that movement of the breath instead of being in the ribs or chest, you're kind of pushing it down to the lower abdomen. And that has a lot of benefits for the organs, for digestion, things like that, because it's giving like internal massage. But do you think it's possible to do that without it necessarily being a big breath that gets that hyperoxygen reaction?
Yeah, well, it makes me think 2 things. Number one, right, this is, if you overbreathe, it's a factor of volume and rate. You could breathe huge, big breaths, and if you kept the rate low, it might still be the right size.
So it's something like Ujjayi, where you're kind of constricting the throat a little bit and slowing down the rate as it goes in and out.
Right.
That might be a solution for some people.
Yeah, so you may be doing a little bit larger breath than Ujjayi breathing than what you need, but if in that throat constriction you're doing, you actually slow the rate down, it makes it okay. We actually have a pretty big bandwidth of the volume that we can move and the rate that we can breathe in, and our body is fine with it. It's just if those 2 are combined in a way that's equals hyperventilation, then it's harder. But, you know, back to your point about the mechanics of the breath, there is no doubt, you know, we think of the diaphragm as a muscle that helps us with respiration. And the fact is, it does so much more than that. So respiration is one aspect of it, to move air in and out to help with gas exchange. But the diaphragm also helps with GI mobility, just because of the mechanical pressure it exerts into the internal organs. It helps with venous return. So it helps get blood back to the heart just by way of the way it squishes the vessels going through it. And really, most notably, it's a muscle that helps us with posture tremendously. So it helps regulate intrathoracic and intra-abdominal pressure, which, as we understand now more about the mechanics of quote-unquote core stability, we get that really what we're talking about with core stability is not how much you can contract your abs. It's how well do you do regulating pressure in your intrathoracic and your intra-abdominal area. And our diaphragm is the biggest player for that. So when your diaphragm actually functions correctly and helps regulate intrathoracic and intra-abdominal pressure, it trips a whole neural pattern that is actually what is core stability. So core stability, much less actually about the strength of anything. And it has more to do with patterning. And diaphragm, because of its ability to regulate intrathoracic and intra-abdominal pressure, is the biggest player, is a huge player in postural stability or movement stability.
Wow, yeah, I've definitely noticed doing Qigong standing meditation or sitting meditation that it seems to make it a lot more effortless to remain erect. If I can get these deep breaths that feel like they kind of fill my low back or my waist or something, it's almost like the breath creates this cushion that expands in the abdomen there and makes it easy to be upright.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're feeling that. I think even the Taoist practice of the microcosmic orbit, that visualizing breath in the loop that's described, I think if you really listen to your body, you can feel it trip that neural pattern of stability. It really does. It helps your body find the effortless way to be up. So in other words, it helps the right stuff turn on and the wrong stuff turn off. But that what you're referring to as a deep breath, that, you know, breathing into your back body or getting that lower lateral rib expansion, is actually a normal breath. So when we are breathing correctly and our diaphragm descends, it should create a 360-degree expansion. So our diaphragm with a breath in descends down into our pelvic cavity and, you know, kind of pushes the organs out. At the same time, our external intercostal muscles lift our ribs up. And so a good breath in, we really, you know, we should be able to put our hands around the lower rib cage, thumbs in the back, and actually feel that breath expand, posterior and lateral. In other words, expand in the back and expand out to the side. Frequently in Qigong and other practices, you know, they look at that as a breathing exercise by itself, almost as if then it's something you walk away from when you're done with that exercise. But that's actually the normal breath. That's a breath done well. That happens in a body that isn't holding tension in the back in a bad sort of way. That is actually a mental and a physical sense of being free that allows that breath to be that expansion that you've talked about. So a deep breath that you're referring to probably is just really feeling what should happen even when you're not feeling it.
That's interesting. Yeah, I know the Taoists, they call that breath the deep abdominal 360 expansion. They usually call it the original breath. And because they have this kind of story that, you know, when infants are born, that's how they breathe, is their belly does this big expansion. And then I think they usually say, like, after a few months, that starts to go away and the breath starts to move its way up into the chest. Is there any truth to that, or is that just a Taoist story?
Well, no, I mean, I think that is how we start, and it is actually how we can live our lives.
Yeah. But do you get to be immortal if you breathe like that?
No doubt.
Becoming soft as a baby again.
You at least get to be happier in the time that you're here. Yeah, and so I think if we take, you know, so we've talked about the mechanics of the breath and what are the right mechanics, and then if we layer on top of that what we know about the chemistry of breath, you know, what we would say is in a sitting meditation practice that you might first dial into that posterolateral rib expansion and feel your ability to move there. And then once you've got that ability, then shift gears into how subtle can you make that.
So you start with using the big breath or bigger breath as a way to just start to get that feeling into there, get the feeling of the movement. You actually have something to pay attention to if the breath is a little bigger.
Yeah.
And making it a little more subtle.
Yeah. And in the clinic, when we work on this with people, everybody gets that feeling of, even when they've got the mechanics beautiful, where they've got that nice posterolateral rib expansion, if that is not completely normal for you, it won't be long before the intercostal muscles start saying they want to stretch. And so when you're doing this subtle, nice breathing, it still is always fantastic to just take that big breath that expands your rib cage, stretches out your intercostals, moves lactic acid out of your intercostals. Your body loves that. So don't ever rob yourself of that. But what I would say is, yes, take that one deep breath, get that cleansing feeling through the muscles between your ribs, and then come back to your breathing that will actually center you.
All right, so we covered the original breath, but probably the breath everybody's wondering about now that we're talking about oxygenation is holotropic breathing. So what is the relationship between this carbon dioxide, alkaline, oxygen balance you're talking about and this sort of quick holotropic breathing, for those people who don't know, basically consists of sort of very hard and fast style of breathing. You're really blowing the breath out, and the idea is sort of to hyperoxygenate the blood. So I assume something like this is happening as well here.
Yeah. I'm not an expert at that, but I do know the technique that you're talking about. And I have absolutely no doubt that in that case, if we had somebody hooked up to capnography, we would see the CO2 levels plummet. And what's actually going to happen is the first structure that gets deoxygenated is the frontal cortex of your brain. And so maybe one of the techniques, what's actually happening is in this, we're actually shutting down activity in the frontal cortex of the brain because we're robbing it of oxygen.
Wow, that's not good.
Apparently, yeah. I mean, I certainly have heard anecdotal stories of people getting things from that experience that they feel is really positive. So I'm not willing to throw the whole thing in the garbage, but I think we can certainly say that we're seeing CO2 levels dramatically drop by doing that kind of behavior. And now what effect that has, I don't really know. If we look at pranayama techniques, like I said, we know that there are some people who actually have an improvement in baseline after it. And so maybe this is an exaggeration of that. I'm not really sure. But you can be assured that is hyperventilation.
So some improvement in baseline, so you mean some people who do these types of exercises, at first it drops the carbon dioxide, raises the oxygen, it all gets bound to the hemoglobin, and it's no good necessarily, but maybe the net effect after that is that the baseline carbon dioxide becomes lower because the body somehow adapts to that, or?
It actually bumps back up. So we'll see people who do pranayama techniques or hyperventilation techniques, if they went into it breathing well, when we look at them in the minutes after they've stopped the activity, we actually see their baseline be a little bit better than the baseline before. In other words, they're retaining more CO2.
Well, that's interesting. So maybe the body has some sort of balancing effect.
There's like a reset button that gets hit. Yeah.
So I guess there could be some long-term benefit to every once in a while hyperoxygenating.
Could be. Yep. Yeah. I won't rule it out. I'm not going to advocate it, but I just put it in the category of I just don't know enough about that yet.
Yeah. Well, for me, I first came across it in high school, and we make ourselves pass out. We hyperventilate for 5 minutes, and then you do something weird like block off the blood flow to your head or something, and you pass out. But it got ruined for me. I had a buddy who was supposed to catch me when I fell over, but instead he just kind of pushed me off to the side, and I hit my head and had a seizure for about 30 seconds. So
yeah, I think we shouldn't recommend people do that.
It's probably not a good idea.
I don't think so.
At least do it sitting or lying down.
Yeah, or wear a helmet.
Yeah, or wear a helmet when you're doing it. This is not medical advice.
Yeah, don't do that.
All right, cool. Well, last time you walked me through 3 really interesting breathing exercises that are sort of to have this experience and learn how to take these smaller breaths in a way that sort of eases you into it. So maybe you want to walk me through a few of those again, and anybody who's watching can also partake or just save this for later and try it again some other time.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
Cool.
So the breathing strategies that we'll use all equate to one thing, and that's just actually making the breath more subtle or breathing a little bit less. We know with capnography that unfortunately, there's not one technique that works for everybody. We do play with several of them to just see what's going to work best for that person in the moment. So as you're doing this, and as any of the viewers are doing this, if we're doing one that doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right. And so don't hang with it. And the second thing I'll say with it is, this is not actually how you should breathe. I mean, really how you should breathe is that your respiratory centers in your hindbrain are regulating it and you're not even thinking about it. So we'll do some things where we're bringing conscious and awareness to it. And in that, we're doing something artificial. And so I hate the idea of people leaving feeling burdened that, wow, this is how I have to breathe all the time. We do know that if you take some time and you play with these things that are artificial or these things that are a remedial way to improve your breathing, that actually it can hit the reset in a nice way. So with that framing, I'll take you through a couple of techniques.
Cool.
So the first one, just sitting comfortable upright, shoulders relaxed, tongue resting on the roof of your mouth, breathing in and out through your nose. What we'll do is put some attention into the breath in. So we won't worry about the breath out. We won't worry about the rate. But what I invite you to do is see if you can take a little recreation in minimizing the volume of air that you bring in. I use those words intentionally. So in other words, there should be a lightness and a curiosity about this instead of a, kind of a hard task that you're working hard to do. So it's just starting to minimize the amount of air that you breathe in and see if you can find a way to do it that sort of feels surprisingly comfortable. And just let the exhale be what it wants. Just take that small sip of air in. And so for some people, this will be a nice bump up in CO2, and for other people, it won't do anything, or it may send them the other direction. You ready for the next one?
Yeah, that definitely got easier and easier with each breath.
Okay.
Yeah.
So did that one feel good?
It did, yeah. It brought definitely a sense of stillness and calm. Almost forgot it. We were live streaming right now.
And with all of these, if at any point you want to take that big breath in, you've just got something that says that would feel good. Yeah, by all means, you take that big breath in, appreciate what it does to move lactic acid out of the muscles, and then settle back into the strategy.
Cool.
And so the second one, and this time we'll actually pay attention to the exhale, and we'll let the inhale be whatever it wants. And the attention that you'll bring to the exhale is to think of just savoring the first 1/3 of that exhale. In other words, slow down the first 1/3. We tend to just kind of crash through and not give any attention to that first 1/3. So now just see if you can hold it back a little bit, just enough that you can feel it. And then at the tail end of the exhale, let it be what it wants, move into the inhale. And then on the next exhale again, just kind of slow down, feel or savor that first 1/3. And what'd you think of that one compared to the first?
Yeah, about the same. At first, a little bit uncomfortable, like, I'm not getting enough air in. And then the more I did it, it seemed like my body adjusted to it or something. And all of a sudden, it was like I barely needed any air at all. And I became very calm. So that initial discomfort, why is there that initial discomfort?
Yeah, two things. One of it can just be the frontal part of your cortex saying, I'm getting less air, I should be concerned. Okay. But there is the phenomenon that if you improve your CO2 too much, too fast, essentially your bicarbonates from your kidneys aren't keeping up, and you'll feel that discrepancy. So you can improve your CO2, but what we haven't talked about is CO2 eventually drives increased production of bicarbonates from your kidneys. And although that happens pretty fast, it's not as fast as you can change CO2. And so your body can feel a little of that discrepancy, which will translate to just not feeling right. It's not life-threatening, and it's actually an okay feeling, but it won't feel right.
The bicarbonate from the kidneys alkalizes the blood?
Yeah. So bicarbonates are a buffer.
Oh, so they'll release it when you have too much CO2.
Yeah, or as your CO2, it's more like as your CO2 climbs, your body automatically knows it wants to bring up the bicarbonates as well, which is fantastic because bicarbonates actually buffer a lot. And so it's one of the things that just makes our body more resilient. So to have elevated CO2, elevated bicarbonates, fantastic.
Right.
Okay.
We have another exercise for us.
Yes, let's do feather breathing.
Nice.
So for this, we'll start off with a finger on your upper lip. And in this position, what you'll do is quiet your breath to a place that you don't feel any movement on your finger. And so that will mean actually doing both of what we've done so far. You'll minimize the breath in and you'll really slow the breath out. So you can feel some heat on your finger, but you're going to try and minimize it to a place where there's no movement on your finger. Then once you've got that, you can take your finger away and just imagine that your finger is still there, and continue to adopt that strategy of quieting your breath to a place that if there were a feather on your upper lip, you wouldn't move the feather. And how'd you feel with that one?
Yeah, very similar. Initially, a little bit of like feeling like gasping for air a little bit, but just as I ease into it, it seemed again to create this really calm state really, really quickly in my mind. So
yeah, well, no doubt you're probably a bit of a ninja breather.
what does that mean?
In other words, you're well versed at this stuff. You'll reach that pretty quick. Anybody viewing shouldn't feel frustrated if they didn't get to that place. It takes, you know, usually in the clinic we're letting people hang with us for a couple of minutes at least.
You hear that, folks? We got experts here. Don't try this at home. Now try this at home, but try it longer.
Yeah. Be nice to yourself in the process too.
Everyone knows a real ninja can breathe without blowing feathers off their lips.
Right. No movement of the feathers.
Yeah. So now the real questions everyone was wondering is, will this work if you draw a mustache on your finger?
Better. It will work. Yeah.
It'll work even better. Okay.
Absolutely advocate mustaches on your fingers.
Okay, great.
It does actually speak to, there is a sense of levity that will help with this.
Oh.
And so there, no doubt. I mean, what really drives a lot of this breathing dysfunction is our striving and the seriousness of which we live in.
Mm.
And so as we're playing with this, yeah, by all means, to keep it light, to keep curious, to just be interested. And if I could wave a magic wand and help people with one thing, it's to lose the judgment and the self-doubt that comes with any time we're trying something new.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing I remember you telling me the last time we tried this interview was that one of the common types of people that is more likely to suffer from this hyperoxygen, too low carbon dioxide is sort of type A personalities, or really go-getter, active people, really ambitious people who might be more in their sympathetic nervous system more of the time.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about why that might be the case.
Yeah, by all means. I mean, that's it. And as well as in our elite athlete population, especially runners, we'll see this. There's something about swimming that we don't see it as much in swimmers, and it may just be because they've got their face in the water. And even though they're doing mouth breathing, which is not great, their breathing is so regulated that they're getting a net gain out of it. You know, and the rest really is kind of theory as to why it is we see it in the hard driving type A type personalities. But I do think it has a lot to do with if we spend our life leaning forward, kind of living in our front body, which means always striving, always reaching, and not actually getting enough time and enough practice to just be settled. I think that is what starts to drive our breathing into these patterns of overbreathing. There are other things that can drive it as well. You can have metabolic function that's not right. That'll drive overbreathing. And then that metabolic dysfunction can go away, but the breathing pattern can stay. So it isn't just how we're approaching life and how we're responding to it. But I do think for a lot of the people we see in the clinic, that's the biggest driver of it.
Would the metabolic thing, would it be more high metabolism people?
It could be a transient kidney dysfunction, or it could be kidney dysfunction driving this. Anything that actually tips the metabolic process in the wrong direction will have an effect on respiration. And so we're always vigilant for things like that. You know, we've got to make sure that the big things have been ruled out, like, you know, problems with heart and lung function or any other internal system. But generally people are coming to us with normal blood pressure, normal heart rate, all their labs look good, you know, but those are always good things to check off first.
Cool. Well, it was fun doing this again.
Thank you, Nick.
I love those exercises that make me feel good every time I do it. I've been starting to mix them into my Qigong classes, so we kind of go between the deep breathing exercises and the small breathing exercises. And
beautiful. Yeah.
They're digging it.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for enlightening me and whoever happens to be watching with this awesome information. If people want to work with you, where can they find you?
You can look at therapeuticassociates.com and search my name, David Deppeler. I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Cool. Is there any way do you ever work with people online in any way?
It is possible to do this. We've sent capital trainers out to people, and it lends itself well to the online platform. Do a little screen sharing so that I can see what's happening on their computer and coach from video.
Oh, cool. Well, awesome. You folks heard it. I'll put some links in the show notes or the YouTube description here. And great. Well, thanks for following. Thank you to David. If you're watching this, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment non-trolly comments, and practice these breathing exercises. See if they make a difference in your life. All right. Thank you, David. Catch you soon.
Thank you.